In this podcast on Islamic finance, we will cover the question, what is Islamic finance? Next, we will delve into the 4 principles of Islamic finance. We are not going to cover all 4 of them, but we will look at the first 3. The 4th principle will be deferred to the next podcast. What is Islamic finance? The author of the book Understanding Islamic Finance, which you see depicted on the right, is Muhammad Ayub. And he tells us that Islamic finance dates back to the 1960s, when isolated institutions providing Sharia-compliant financial services first emerged here and there. It was in the 1970s when Sharia-compliant finance truly took off. Specifically in 1975, when the Dubai Islamic Bank was established in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and when the Islamic Development Bank was established in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. By now, Sharia-compliant finance is fairly widespread. You can have access to it in over 75 countries. And there are more than 550 Islamic financial institutions. Numerous conventional Western banks have a thing that's called an Islamic window. So for most of their operations, they provide conventional banking services that follow the standards we have in the West. But part of their operations is Islamically oriented. It's Islamic finance, and that is provided through that Islamic window. We in the West have many questions about that sort of finance. What is it really? How does it work? Can it work? Is it more than smoke and mirrors? Is Islamic finance a true alternative to Western conventional banking? And these are some of the questions we shall explore in this session of the course. What is Islamic finance? Islamic finance and Sharia-compliant finance are synonyms. Essentially, it is finance with morality. And it is specifically a morality rooted in the Islamic worldview, as established by the Quran and the Hadith, the reports of the Prophet. And then later on, as you remember, an elaborate school of jurisprudence emerged in the Islamic Middle Ages that shapes Islamic jurisprudence to the present day, and it's called fiqh. Maybe the closest Western equivalent of that is what we call socially responsible investment, where you do not invest in just any stock, but you say, I want to invest in stocks that are fair to workers, that are good for the environment, and so on. So there also you constrain your financial activities to certain rules, certain ethical and moral rules. Let's now look at the 4 basic principles of Islamic finance. And for that, I looked at 3 books. Muhammad Ayub's Understanding Islamic Finance that I just showed you. Then on the right, you see Brian Kettle's Islamic Finance in a Nutshell. And in the middle, the book by Amir A. Rahman, who wrote Gulf Capital and Islamic Finance, The Rise of the New Global Players. Most of the book is not about the topic that we're discussing here today, but one chapter is, and it is really quite useful. The first principle is that you should not profit from something that is immoral. That begs the question, what does Islam consider immoral? And the answer that scholars typically come up with is there are certain products and services. Prostitution is immoral. The same is true for the sale of alcohol. Islam does not condone its believers drinking alcohol because it intoxicates them and renders them irrational, and hence it does not condone you selling alcohol. It also does not condone the production of tobacco, even though when you go into Middle Eastern countries, you will find many, many men who do smoke cigarettes. In Egypt, if you ride in a taxi, you may ask the taxi driver, how many cigarettes do you smoke a day? And he'll tell you, as he told me, that he'll smoke about 80 cigarettes a day. So it's a lot. So Islam does have standards of what is considered immoral. And those concern products and services. But what is typically not addressed is the question, is a business that exploits its workforce immoral? A scholar of law, Susan Haskell of Duquesne University, says that the Quran clearly demands a just treatment of workers. And she translates that in the present day and age to the requirement that workers at least get the payment of a living wage. In Islamic finance, that is not necessarily a consideration that is taken into account. But perhaps that will be the case in the future as the phenomenon develops. Principle B, don't sell anything that you do not own. And that addresses in the West the practice of shorting stock. Now, how does that work? You may be well versed in that, practicing business, but in case you are not, let me just repeat it here very quickly. Let's say you are the manager of a hedge fund, and that is Bridgewater. Bridgewater wants to make money, and it realizes that the stock price for a certain stock right now is high. It goes to a pension fund, CalPERS, which is one of the biggest, and because pension funds are much less risk-friendly than hedge funds, Bridgewater tells CalPERS, hey, why don't you lend us your stock for a fee? A stock whose price is high. CalPERS says, sure, we'll do it, because you will give us our stock back in the future for sure, together with a fee, so why wouldn't we do that? Bridgewater then turns around and sells the stock on the short stock market on Wall Street. And because it doesn't own the stock, we say that it is shorting the stock. Bridgewater's hope is that the price of the stock is falling. And when that happens, if that happens, Bridgewater goes back to Wall Street and buys that same stock that it sold just a while ago. It returns the stock to CalPERS, but it pockets the profit that it has made from selling the stock while it was high and buying the stock while the price was low. That, of course, is risky. What happens when you short a stock, but then actually the price goes up? So that is what is often happening in Western stock markets with hedge funds. In the Islamic finance model, that is not permitted, because you have to own what you sell. Rahman, the author of the book on Gulf Capital, says that there is an important consequence to this. Specifically, Islamic investors are required to take a more fundamental view of investments, buying assets that they believe will appreciate and avoiding those that they believe will decline in value. In other words, Islamic investors don't just go to the stock market and speculate. They invest for the long run. They invest things they own, and they hope that they appreciate over the long run. Speculation is minimized. There is an exception to the requirement that you must not sell something that you don't own. And the exception is one that you will come across in the readings that you do, and it is called the Saleh contract. What happened here is that the Prophet Muhammad allowed poor farmers to do a forward contract. I stated here future contract. It's really a forward contract on their livestock and harvest. The farmers had very little liquidity, but they needed money in order to invest in their agriculture, and therefore they told buyers, if you promise to buy my agricultural produce now that it's not yet grown, I will sell it to you at a specific price, but you have to give me that price, pay that price now. Under exceptional circumstances, that is permissible, but only under exceptional circumstances. The next principle of Islamic finance is that you must specify what exactly it is you're selling and what price the other individual, the buyer, is paying. That sounds straightforward, but in reality, in our economic system, that sometimes does not happen. The principle underlying this idea is that Islam does not like uncertainty or gharar in economic transactions. It wants to minimize, if you will, the incidence of lemons. For those of you who are not native English speakers, a lemon is a product that looks good, it looks shiny, but it is defective. And the seller knows that the product is defective, but the buyer does not. And that is something that is not okay in Islam. In order to avoid that incident, the buyer must get the opportunity to inspect the product he or she is buying. What does that mean in practice? Western type insurance is not admissible. There's simply too much opacity and uncertainty. You buy an insurance, you pay something, but you don't know what you're really getting out of it when you get sick. What services do you get exactly? What is the insurance company giving you? It is truly quite opaque, and anybody who has had a medical claim can testify to that. The alternative in Saudi Arabia, for example, is a practice called takaful, which we're not going to get into, but there are alternatives to Western type insurance. Another thing that is not admissible is the kind of car auction that you find sometimes here in the United States. And I personally had the experience many years ago that I wanted to buy a car. And my uncle, who had been living in the United States for a long time, took me, who just arrived in the US and was very new to everything, to a car auction and said, hey Nivien, why don't we buy a car for you here and we'll get it really cheaply. So we looked at the cars that were there, and some cars were sold as is. My uncle said, there's a Hyundai and you should really get that. That looks like it's the right car for you. It's not expensive. We will bid on it. We bid on it. We got it. My uncle was happy because we didn't pay a lot of money. But as we drove the car out of the lot, we ran into trouble immediately because there was spray that had gotten into the carburetor or radiator. You can tell I'm not a car expert. I think it was the radiator, and it just clogged everything up, and so the car had to be towed. What's more, the window didn't close correctly. Therefore, when the car was towed to a garage, the car somehow couldn't be locked or the window couldn't be closed, and as a result, somebody stole the radio. And then later on something happened with the cylinder, so one cylinder broke. It was not a pleasant experience. And that happened because we did not have the opportunity to expect what we were buying. There was a lot of gharar, uncertainty, opacity, and we bought a lemon. Another example of what is not permitted is the idea of the collateralized debt obligations. Those are securities that are based on payment commitments of clients that mature at different rates, and they are taken and bundled and sold as one security. I suggest you look it up on the internet if you're not entirely sure what it is. Collateralized debt obligations that presented a problem in the financial crisis of 2007-2008 are not permissible in Islamic finance.